habits in households where the master's displeasure could cost a person their livelihood before sunrise.
I made the dish
He slammed
myself,
his palm
sir.
down onto the wood, a sudden, violent crack that caused the crystal glassware nearby to ring out in protest. I asked a simple question, and I expect an immediate answer from someone in this room before I start firing people by the block. His head butler, an impeccably composed man named Thomas who had managed the Connecticut estate for over 2 decades, stood perfectly stiff, though a faint bead of sweat had begun to track down the side of his pale cheek. Next to him, the night housekeeper looked as though she might faint straight onto the imported Persian rug, her fingers clutching the edge of her apron with a white-knuckled desperation that spoke of absolute terror. For months, the Sterling mansion had been a place of calculated misery, a sprawling compound of glass and stone where the sheer weight of Arthur's chronic insomnia had driven the entire staff into a state of permanent exhaustion. When a billionaire cannot sleep, no one sleeps. When a man with $40 billion in logistics assets spends his nights pacing the corridors because his stomach feels like it is digesting broken glass, every single employee moves through the hallways like an inmate waiting for a sentence to be handed down. Arthur's gaze finally rose from the bowl, his eyes bloodshot, framed by deep, dark hollows that no amount of expensive medical care could erase. He looked at the 3 night shift maids who had been summoned from their duties, their faces a blur of terrified confusion. Every single chef I have hired from Paris, Tokyo, and New York has served me nothing but gold leaf garbage that tastes like paper, Arthur muttered, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous rasp that was somehow far more menacing than his earlier shout. They come here with their Michelin stars, their culinary degrees, and their $1 million insurances, telling me they can cure my ailment with macrobiotic science. And yet, tonight, I walk into my own kitchen, find this nameless bowl left on a counter, and for the first time in 7 years, my stomach doesn't burn. For the first time in 7 years, I remember what it feels like to be human. He picked up the silver spoon, his hand trembling slightly from sheer fatigue, and let a single drop of the broth hit the polished metal. So I am going to ask you one last time, Thomas. Who sneaked into my kitchen and made this? Thomas cleared his throat, his posture tightening even further into a defensive shield of professional restraint. Sir, the main kitchen has been locked since executive chef John Louis departed at 8 o'clock. The security protocols are absolute. No one is permitted near the industrial ranges without a biometric pass. Arthur gave a short, humorless laugh, a sound so dry it felt like winter wind. Then I suppose the ghost of my mother came back from the dead to peel potatoes, Thomas? Because this is her recipe. Not the commercial version she published in her books, but the exact, unrefined soup she used to cook in our small apartment in South Boston before we ever had a dollar to our name. He slammed the spoon back into the bowl, the liquid splashing over the rim. Don't lie to me. Someone in this house knows exactly where this came from, and if the person responsible doesn't step into this room in the next 60 seconds, I am clearing out the entire service staff by dawn. The threat hung in the air, cold and absolute, stripping the room of any remaining pretense of comfort. The servants exchanged terrified glances, each waiting for someone else to break, to offer up a name, to provide any excuse that would satisfy the billionaire's desperate, angry curiosity. Outside the tall, floor-to-ceiling windows, the Connecticut sky was a dark, featureless blanket of New England winter, the wind rattling the bare branches of the oak trees like skeletal fingers. Inside, the only sound was the heavy, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, marking the seconds of an interrogation that was rapidly pushing a powerful man to the edge of his sanity. Then, just as Arthur reached for his internal phone to call security, a small, tentative movement at the edge of the hallway caused him to freeze. A little girl, no older than 7, stepped out from the deep shadows of the service entrance, her tiny fingers gripping a worn, faded drawing pad against her chest as she looked up at the terrifying man who owned the world. "Step back from the table immediately," Thomas whispered, his voice cracking with an urgency he could barely suppress as he tried to block Arthur's view of the child. But the billionaire's gaze was already locked onto the little girl, his eyes narrowing as he watched her small, white-knuckled hands grip the edges of her faded drawing pad. Before Arthur could utter another syllable, the heavy double doors of the formal dining room swung open with a dramatic, heavy thud. Executive Chef John Louis entered the room, his white culinary jacket immaculate, his tall toque tilted at an angle that practically demanded unearned respect. He didn't look like a man who had been off the clock for 4 hours, he looked like a performer stepping onto a stage to claim a standing ovation he hadn't yet earned. He took a calculated step forward, purposely stepping directly into the path of the little girl, pushing her back into the shadows of the service doorway with a dismissive sweep of his arm. "There is no need for this midnight circus, Mr. Sterling," Jean-Louis declared, his voice dripping with a practiced, arrogant smoothness that immediately made the skin on Arthur's neck prickle with intense irritation. "The recipe you are praising, the one that finally brought quiet to your suffering stomach, was executed by my own hands before I departed this evening." Arthur didn't move an inch, his fingers remaining wrapped tightly around the cold handle of his silver spoon as he studied the chef's face. "Your hands, Jean-Louis?" Arthur asked, his voice dropping into a low, deceptive register that sounded dangerously like agreement. "That's fascinating, considering that for the last 6 months, you have sworn to me that rustic American broths were nothing more than peasant food, completely incapable of meeting your high-minded nutritional standards." Jean-Louis didn't even flinch, his smile remaining perfectly in place as he adjusted his starched cuffs. "A true master adapts to his patron's hidden psychological cravings, sir. I spent my evening experimenting with heirloom ingredients, blending classic French reduction techniques with the unrefined textures of your childhood memories to create a therapeutic harmony." He stepped closer to the table, reaching out a manicured hand to claim the empty ceramic bowl, eager to erase any physical evidence of the midnight creation. "I left it on the counter to settle, intending to present it to you formally during breakfast, but it seems your intuition guided you to my masterpiece ahead of schedule." The kitchen staff remained frozen, their eyes darting between the celebrated chef and the silent billionaire, the air in the room thick with the distinct, suffocating scent of a professional lie. Arthur watched Jean-Louis's hand move toward the bowl, and just as the chef's fingers brushed the porcelain, Arthur slammed his hand down on the mahogany table a second time, a sharp, echoing crack that made everyone jump. "Leave the bowl right where it is, Jean-Louis," Arthur hissed, his eyes burning with a sudden, dangerous clarity that cut straight through the chef's expensive facade. He stood up slowly, the sheer physical weight of his $40 billion presence filling the space until the executive chef actually had to take a step back. "You see, there's just one tiny problem with your beautiful little story. My mother always used a specific, coarse ground sea salt. Imported from a single coastal village in Maine, a salt that leaves a very distinct, mineral aftertaste at the very back of the throat. It's an ingredient that isn't sold in commercial markets, and it certainly isn't listed in any of the corporate cookbooks you use to train your staff." Arthur stepped around the table, his movement slow and predatory as he forced Jean-Louis to hold his gaze. "I know the exact inventory of every spice and grain in this house, and that salt has never been permitted in your kitchen because you claimed it was too unrefined for your refined palate. So tell me, Jean-Louis, if you cooked this soup, how did you manage to replicate a taste profile that you didn't even know existed?" The chef's arrogant smile finally began to fracture, his pale skin turning an uncharacteristic, blotchy shade of red as he struggled to find a plausible explanation. "Sir, a seasoned palate like mine can instinctively replicate complex flavor structures through advanced molecular gastronomy," Arthur cut him off with a single, dismissive wave of his hand. "Save the corporate jargon for your next interview, Jean-Louis. You are fired. Pack your expensive knives and be off my property before the security gates open at dawn." The chef stood paralyzed for a fraction of a second, his reputation evaporating in the span of a single heartbeat, before he turned on his heel and fled the room, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than stone. Arthur slowly turned his head back toward the dark service entrance, his bloodshot eyes searching the shadows for the tiny figure who had witnessed the entire deception. But as his gaze adjusted to the dim light, he realized the little girl was no longer standing alone, and the shadow looming behind her held a secret that would shake the very foundations of his household. The echoes of the executive chef's hasty departure still rattled the crystal chandelier when Arthur moved toward the dark service corridor, completely ignoring the protests of his head butler. He pushed past the heavy swinging doors that led to the estate's industrial kitchen, a cavernous space of stainless steel and black marble that usually hummed with the high-stress energy of a five-star restaurant. Tonight, however, the vast room was completely silent, illuminated only by the faint, eerie glow of the digital displays on the massive refrigeration units. Arthur's leather shoes clicked sharply against the polished tile floor as he walked past the long preparation stations, his eyes scanning the pristine surfaces for any sign of life. He was a man driven by absolute control, an executive who built an empire by knowing every single detail of his logistics network, yet right now, his own home felt like a foreign country. He stopped near the massive commercial ranges at the far end of the kitchen, his senses suddenly assaulted by the warm, earthy scent of roasted leeks and simmering cream, an aroma that felt entirely out of place in the sterile environment. There, tucked away in the very furthest corner of the station, stood a small, portable electric burner plugged into a wall outlet, an unauthorized piece of equipment that looked like it belonged in a college dorm room rather than a billionaire's mansion. Standing on a heavy wooden crate to reach the counter was the little girl from the hallway, her small face completely focused as she used a wooden spoon to scrape the caramelized bits from the bottom of a small, dented copper pot. Behind her stood Maya, a quiet woman in her late 30s who worked on the daytime laundry staff, her hands stained with the harsh chemicals of industrial bleach, her shoulders hunched in a posture of perpetual apology. Maya's face drained of all color the moment she saw Arthur's towering figure block the exit, and she immediately reached out to pull her daughter down from the crate, shielding the child's body with her own. "Mr. Sterling, please," Maya begged, her voice a fragile whisper that trembled with the terrifying weight of absolute vulnerability. "I will take Lily and leave immediately. We didn't mean to violate your rules, sir. She was just trying to help me because I couldn't afford to buy her dinner tonight." Arthur didn't say a word at first, his gaze drifting from the terrified mother to the little girl, Lily, who was still holding the wooden spoon like a weapon of defense. He looked at the small, mismatched ingredients laid out on the stainless steel counter, a single wrinkled potato, a bundle of wild leeks that looked like they had been harvested from the woods at the edge of the property, and a small, unlabeled glass jar filled with coarse, gray salt crystals. His chest tightened with an unfamiliar, heavy emotion as he recognized the jar. It was the exact same unrefined Maine salt his mother used to keep on the windowsill of their tenement apartment 40 years ago. "Where did you get that salt, Maya?" Arthur demanded, his voice dropping all of its executive harshness, replaced instead by a raw, hollow curiosity that sounded almost broken. Maya swallowed hard, her grip on her daughter's shoulder tightening as she looked down at the floor. "It belonged to my grandmother, sir. She used to cook for families in South Boston a long time ago. It's the only thing I have left of hers." Arthur took a step closer, his eyes fixed on the dented copper pot, his mind racing as he tried to piece together a reality that defied every single rule of logic he believed in. "You didn't cook that soup, did you, Maya?" he asked softly, his bloodshot eyes turning toward the 7-year-old girl who was now staring back at him with a stubborn, unfiltered certainty. Lily lifted her chin, stepping out from behind her mother's protective arm with a quiet dignity that seemed far too old for her small frame. "My mommy didn't do it, sir." "I did," Lily said, her small voice ringing through the vast, empty kitchen with absolute clarity. "Mommy was too tired from washing the big sheets all day, and her hands hurt real bad from the hot water. So I made her the medicine soup my grandma taught me. The soup that makes the burning go away." Arthur looked down at the little girl's hands, noticing for the first time the tiny, faint scars across her knuckles, scars that didn't come from play, but from hours of hard, repetitive labor. He felt a sudden, violent shift in the room's atmosphere, as if a hidden door to his own forgotten past had just been kicked wide open, but before he could ask another question, a cold, sharp voice from the kitchen entrance shattered the fragile moment, revealing that his discovery had already triggered an alarm he could not silence. "What is the meaning of this unauthorized gathering in the middle of the night, Arthur?" Victoria Sterling's voice cut through the warm, savory air of the kitchen like an icy blade, her sharp heels clicking against the tile as she marched into the room. Arthur's older sister, who served as the senior legal counsel for the family's global logistics empire, looked as though she had just stepped out of a corporate boardroom rather than a bedroom in the west wing of the mansion. She wore a tailored wool coat over her silk pajamas, her sharp features set in an expression of absolute disgust as her gaze swept past Arthur and landed directly on Maya and Lily. "Thomas called my quarters and told me you were firing the executive staff over a bowl of soup," Victoria said, her eyes narrowing as she took in the sight of the unauthorized electric burner and the dented copper pot. "I assumed he was exaggerating due to fatigue, but instead I find you interrogating the daytime laundry staff in the dark. This is completely unacceptable," Arthur. You are a man with $40 billion in assets under management, and you are letting a common domestic breach disrupt the entire security protocol of this estate. Arthur turned slowly to face his sister, his expression completely unreadable, his arms folded across his chest as he stood between her and the terrified family. This isn't a domestic breach, Victoria, Arthur said, his voice dropping into a dangerous, low rumble that usually signaled the end of a corporate negotiation. This child just did what a dozen world-class chefs fail to do with all their expensive degrees and macrobiotic science. She cured the inflammation in my stomach using a recipe that hasn't been cooked in this house since our mother died 25 years ago. Victoria let out a short, biting laugh, a sound that held no humor, only cold, calculated condescension. Our mother was a philanthropist, Arthur, not a short-order cook. If this woman's child sneaked into the main kitchen to scavenge for scraps, it is a liability issue, not a culinary miracle. The day. Staff are strictly forbidden from utilizing the family amenities, let alone operating industrial equipment without supervision. She stepped closer, reaching into her pocket to pull out a sleek, black smartphone, her thumb hovering over the screen as she looked at Maya with an expression that treated the human being in front of her as nothing more than an inconvenient line item on a balance sheet. I am calling the security detail to have them escorted from the property immediately, Victoria declared, her voice filled with the absolute authority of a woman who spent her life enforcing boundaries and contracts. We have an international board meeting with our European investors on Thursday morning, and I will not have your chronic insomnia turn into a public relations scandal because you decided to play savior to the help. Maya's eyes filled with tears, her shoulders sinking even lower as she reached down to gather her daughter's faded drawing pad from the counter, preparing herself for the familiar, brutal reality of being discarded without a second thought. Please, Ms. Sterling, Maya whispered, her voice breaking as she looked at the floor. We will go. We don't want any trouble. But as Victoria's thumb moved to press the call button on her phone, Lily took a step forward, her small boots making a definitive sound against the tile as she looked up at the powerful corporate lawyer with an innocent, devastating glare. You have a mean voice, Lily said, her clear American accent striking the room with the force of an uninsulated wire. My grandma told me that people who use big words to hide their small hearts are just scared of the truth. My daddy worked for your family company for 10 whole years in Boston, and when the big machines broke his legs, nobody from your big office ever came to help him either. You just sent a paper that said he didn't work there anymore. Victoria's hand froze over her phone, her sharp face turning a pale, furious shade of white as she looked down at the child, completely caught off guard by a piece of family history she thought had been buried in corporate non-disclosure agreements a decade ago. Arthur's gaze sharpened, his bloodshot eyes turning from his sister's panicked face back to the little girl as a cold, terrible suspicion began to take root in his mind, a suspicion that meant the soup in his stomach wasn't just a random memory, but a reckoning for a crime his own family had committed in the dark. The morning sun did not bring warmth to the Sterling estate, it only cast a hard, merciless light over the long mahogany desk in Arthur's private study where the legal notices were already piled high. By 10 o'clock, the atmosphere inside the mansion had transformed from a private domestic dispute into a high-stakes corporate battlefield, with 3 separate vehicles from the family's Hartford headquarters idling on the gravel drive outside. Victoria sat across from her brother, her fingers tapping a furious, erratic rhythm against the leather trim of her folder, her laptop screen reflecting a sea of red metrics and urgent emails from their European logistics partners. This is no longer about a fired chef, Arthur, Victoria hissed, throwing a bound document across the desk with enough force to scatter his stationery. The board of the Hartford Historical Foundation just caught wind of your little midnight stunt through Jean-Louis' agency. They are threatening to pull our corporate sponsorship for the winter exhibition on Thursday if you do not issue a formal apology and reinstate the kitchen staff immediately. Arthur didn't even look at the documents, his fingers remaining lightly wrapped around his porcelain coffee cup as he watched the winter frost melt off the tall windows behind his sister. Let them pull the sponsorship, Victoria, Arthur said evenly, his voice completely stripped of the erratic anger that had defined his late-night interrogation. For the first time in 3 years, his posture was straight, his breathing deep and regular, his stomach entirely free of the agonizing pain that had ruined his health. The Foundation is more interested in the optics of our family name than the actual history we are preserving. I am not apologizing to a man who tried to steal credit from a 7-year-old child to protect his $70,000 salary. Victoria leaned forward, her eyes burning with a cold, desperate frustration that was rapidly turning into panic. That 7-year-old child is the daughter of a woman who is currently violating 3 separate terms of her employment contract by residing in the service cottage without a security clearance. If the media finds out that Arthur Sterling is basing his corporate decisions on the culinary instincts of an undocumented minor, our stock valuation will drop 5% before the opening bell. Before Arthur could answer, the heavy oak doors of the study opened, and Edwin Mercer stepped into the room, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, a slim leather portfolio tucked under his arm like a shield of institutional authority. The curator looked past Arthur with a practiced, elegant condescension that immediately filled the room with the familiar scent of high-class doubt. "Mr. Sterling, Miss Sterling," Mercer said, adjusting his rimless spectacles as he took a seat without invitation. "I have just completed a preliminary review of the situation at the request of the Foundation Board. I must confess, the rumors circulating through the local collector circles are quite distressing. To suggest that a common domestic employee has successfully replicated the historical flavor profile of the Sterling Heritage Collection is not just romantic, it is an insult to the standard of preservation we have spent a century establishing." He opened his folio, sliding a sheet of cream paper across the desk, his finger pointing to a series of technical specifications. "True culinary restoration requires rigorous, credentialed methodology. An untrained child operating in an unsanitary environment cannot produce an authentic artifact. It is a statistical impossibility, Arthur." Arthur picked up the paper, his eyes scanning the clinical, cold language Mercer had used to reduce Lily's natural genius into a security anomaly. He let out a slow, terrifying breath that caused both Victoria and Mercer to go completely still. "An statistical impossibility, Mercer?" Arthur asked, his voice dropping into that low, dangerous rasp that always preceded a hostile takeover. "Then I suppose my own stomach is an unscientific anomaly? Because I have spent $1 million on your credentialed specialists, and every single one of them served me poison disguised as art." He stood up, his massive frame blocking the morning light as he looked down at the curator with an expression of absolute contempt. "On Thursday morning, the exhibition will proceed exactly as planned, but we are making a slight adjustment to the program. I am bringing the copper pot, the unrefined salt, and the child who cooked it straight into the Foundation Gallery, and if your credentialed circle doesn't like the flavor of truth, they can find another billionaire to fund their museum." Mercer's face went entirely pale, his hands trembling slightly as he closed his portfolio, realizing too late that the billionaire wasn't just defending a maid's daughter, he was preparing to burn down the entire social architecture of the city to prove a point. The industrial kitchen of the Sterling estate had never felt less like a workspace and more like an execution chamber than it did on Tuesday afternoon, under the blinding glare of the additional halogen lights Victoria had ordered installed. A long, stainless steel preparation table had been moved into the very center of the room, surrounded by 3 members of the Foundation's executive board, 2 independent food safety inspectors, and Edwin Mercer, who stood near the pantry with a digital stopwatch in his hand. Victoria had made her terms clear: if the child could not replicate the exact chemical and flavor profile of the midnight soup under strict, double-blind laboratory conditions, Maya and Lily would be turned over to the corporate legal team for immediate prosecution under a breach of privacy clause. Maya stood near the dishwashing stations, her face buried in her apron, her entire body shaking with a silent, agonizing terror as she watched her 7-year-old daughter climb onto the wooden crate once again, completely surrounded by a circle of powerful, silent adults who wanted nothing more than to see her fail. Lily wore her navy blue dress, her hair pinned back with a cheap plastic clip, her small hands looking impossibly fragile against the cold industrial surface of the professional workspace. In front of her lay 3 identical sets of ingredients provided by the inspection team, 3 peeled potatoes, 3 bundles of leeks, and 3 identical bowls of water, with no labels or markers to indicate their origin. Mercer stepped forward, his voice echoing sharply against the tile walls as he started his stopwatch. "You have exactly 45 minutes to produce an identical sample, young lady. There will be no assistance from your mother, and no access to unauthorized seasonings. The safety inspectors will monitor every movement of your hands to ensure compliance with institutional standards. Lily didn't look at the stopwatch, and she certainly didn't look at Mercer's cold, triumphant smile. She simply picked up a heavy, commercial chef's knife that was nearly as long as her arm, her tiny fingers wrapping around the handle with a practiced, instinctive grip that caused the safety inspectors to lean forward in sudden surprise. Arthur stood at the very back of the room, his arms folded, his bloodshot eyes tracking every single movement of the child's hands with an intense, unyielding focus that ignored his sister's frequent, anxious glances. He watched as Lily sliced the leeks, her technique rough and unrefined, lacking the geometric perfection of Jean-Louis's classical training, but executed with a fluid, natural economy of motion that only comes from a child who had been forced to help her family survive in the kitchen from the moment she could walk. She didn't use a measuring cup or a digital scale, she simply dropped the vegetables into the pot, her small head tilted slightly to the side, listening to the specific, rhythmic hiss of the butter as it hit the hot metal. When she reached for the salt, Mercer stepped directly into her path, his hand extended to intercept the unlabeled glass jar of Maine salt Meyer had brought from the cottage. "This ingredient has not been cleared by the chemical lab for contamination, Arthur," Mercer protested, his voice rising in a desperate attempt to halt the process. "We cannot permit an unregulated substance to be introduced into an official verification test." Arthur didn't say a word, he simply took 2 long strides forward, his massive hand coming down over Mercer's wrist with a crushing, silent pressure that forced the curator's fingers to release the jar instantly. "The salt stays, Mercer," Arthur said, his voice a low, terrifying whisper that made the board members near the table step back in fear. "The salt is the only thing in this room that isn't fake." Lily picked up the jar, her small fingers taking a precise, 3-finger pinch of the coarse grey crystals, letting them track slowly through the air and into the simmering broth with a reverence that looked almost religious. The minutes ticked away on the digital wall clock, the steam rising from the copper pot filling the sterile room with that same warm, unforgettable aroma that had saved Arthur's sanity 48 hours ago. When the stopwatch finally beeped, Lily set her wooden spoon down on the table, her small chest rising and falling with exhaustion as she looked up at the circle of silent judges. The safety inspector stepped forward with a sterile silver syringe, drawing a sample of the broth to test its density and acidity against the midnight container, and as the digital reader began to process the data, a sudden, heavy electronic beep filled the room, sending a wave of absolute shock across Victoria's face that proved the little girl hadn't just matched the standard. She had exposed a terrifying truth that would change the upcoming exhibition into a public execution of the family's darkest secrets. The Grand Exhibition Hall of the Hartford Historical Foundation was a sea of tailored tuxedos and shimmering evening gowns, but the atmosphere inside felt as fragile as spun glass. Beneath the towering neoclassical arches, the city's elite drifted from one glass display case to another, holding crystal flutes of champagne while whispering about the sudden, bizarre rumors coming from the Sterling estate. Standing directly under the main spotlight was the long velvet draped table holding the Sterling family collection, but instead of Chef Jean-Louis or a team of credentialed culinary historians, Arthur stood beside Meyer and Lily. The child looked incredibly small against the backdrop of towering oil paintings and marble pillars, her navy blue dress neat but noticeably simple compared to the designer garments filling the room. Victoria stood near the entrance, her arms tightly crossed as she watched her brother upend decades of carefully managed public relations with a single, unyielding decision. Pembroke, the powerful chairman of the foundation board, stepped forward with his hands clasped behind his back, his face a mask of polite disapproval that had been perfected through 40 years of corporate philanthropy. "Arthur, we have proceeded with the exhibition as you demanded, but I must urge you to reconsider this public display," Pembroke murmured, his voice low enough to avoid the nearby reporters but sharp enough to carry an undeniable threat. "The foundation has donors, historical reputations, and structural optics to protect. To present an uncredentialed child as the savior of the Sterling legacy, especially in front of our European partners, is an improvisation that borders on institutional negligence." Edwin Mercer stood just behind him, nodding in silent agreement, his eyes gleaming with the smug satisfaction of a man who believed the weight of high society would finally force the billionaire to back down. Arthur didn't take his eyes off the crowd, his face perfectly composed as he took a slow sip of his black coffee. "This foundation claims to celebrate history, Pembroke, but you are only interested in a history that has been washed, ironed, and approved by a marketing committee," Arthur said, his voice dropping into that quiet, dangerous register that made the board members nearby shift their weight in discomfort. You call it negligence, I call it accuracy. Every single document on that table proves that this child's hands just achieved what your entire system couldn't. Before Pembroke could formulate a polished, legalistic retort, Lily looked up from her faded drawing pad, her clear voice slicing through the low murmur of the elitist crowd with an innocent, devastating precision. "Why do you keep trying to hide my name on the little white card?" Lily asked, her large, searching eyes looking directly into Pembroke's cold face. "My grandma said that when grown-ups are ashamed of who fixed something, it's usually because they wanted people to think they were the ones who were smart enough to do it. Bo Chow didn't hide behind a big office when your factory machines broke his legs, but you still used your big words to make him disappear from your books." A heavy, suffocating silence dropped over the immediate circle of investors as Lily's words echoed against the marble floor, and as Victoria's cell phone began to vibrate violently in her hand, Arthur realized the child hadn't just embarrassed the board, she had just pulled the first thread of a corporate cover-up that reached all the way back to their late father's desk. The vibrating phone in Victoria's hand wasn't a standard corporate update, it was an urgent alert from the family's archival department in Boston, and the expression on her face turned from icy frustration to sheer, unadulterated panic. She practically shoved her way past Edwin Mercer, dragging Arthur into the deep shadow of a marble pillar away from the watchful eyes of the journalists. "Arthur, you need to shut this down right now," Victoria whispered, her voice trembling with a raw, frantic energy that Arthur had never heard from his sister in his entire life. She held up her tablet, her thumb shaking as she scrolled through a digitized file from 1996, a file that had been stamped with a permanent corporate seal of non-disclosure. Maya's family isn't just a random line of domestic help from South Boston. Her grandmother, Clara Johnson, was the head chef of our father's first logistics facility, the one that funded our entire empire. Arthur's gaze sharpened, his bloodshot eyes locking onto the faded digital document on the screen. As his eye scanned the old payroll ledgers and legal correspondence, a cold, sickening realization began to settle in his chest. The famous sterling potato leek recipe that had built their mother's philanthropic reputation and filled their corporate cookbooks wasn't a sterling creation at all, it had been completely stolen from Clara Johnson during a corporate restructuring event 30 years ago. When Clara protested, their father had used his massive legal team to bankrupt her husband, strip their family of their intellectual property, and force them into a multi-generational cycle of poverty. The unrefined Maine salt, the specific ratio of wild leeks, the exact density of the broth, it was all a stolen legacy that the Sterling family had used to buy their way into high society. Arthur walked slowly back into the center of the brightly lit gallery, his leather shoes sounding like a death march against the marble tile as he approached the display case where Lily and Maya stood. Pembroke was in the middle of reassuring an international investor when Arthur reached out, picked up the velvet-backed folder containing the official historical summary of the Sterling collection, and tossed it directly into a nearby brass trash receptacle. The entire room went completely silent, the flutes of champagne freezing mid-air as the billionaire turned to face the crowd, his voice echoing through the vast neoclassical space with the terrifying weight of absolute honesty. "For 30 years, this city has praised my family for a genius we didn't own, a culture we borrowed, and a dignity we stole from the very people who built our foundation," Arthur declared, his bloodshot eyes staring directly into the pale, horrified faces of the board members. He turned to Maya, whose eyes were wide with a mixture of terror and sudden, overwhelming hope, and as he prepared to speak the words that would dismantle his family's billion-dollar reputation, a sudden commotion at the main gallery doors revealed that the past wasn't finished throwing its heaviest blows. The legal and social fallout from Arthur's public confession tore through the Hartford elite like a wildfire, but inside the sprawling Connecticut mansion, the air had finally become clear. By the following spring, the grand dining room was no longer a cold museum of calculated misery or an interrogation chamber for exhausted servants. The heavy mahogany table had been rearranged to accommodate a far more human kind of routine. The $3,000 chandelier still cast its warm, golden light over the room, but tonight, the space was filled with the rich, unmistakable aroma of simmering wild leeks, roasted potatoes, and coarse Maine sea salt. Maya no longer wore the chemical-stained apron of the laundry staff, she sat at Arthur's right hand, serving as the newly appointed director of the Sterling Heritage Culinary Foundation, an independent organization funded by a $10 million endowment from Arthur's personal assets. Lily sat on a booster chair next to her mother, her faded drawing pad open on the table, her small pencil moving with a fluid, confident rhythm as she sketched the antique grandfather clock in the corner. Her face held none of the guarded carefulness that had defined her midnight presence in the kitchen months ago. Her cheeks were bright, her eyes sparkling with the absolute security of a child who no longer had to use her talent as a weapon of survival. Victoria had retreated to the corporate offices in New York, unable to bear the loss of her pristine social seating charts, but Arthur didn't miss her presence for a single second. His posture was relaxed, his deep, dark hollows completely gone, his stomach entirely healed by a daily diet of honesty and the simple, rustic food of his forgotten childhood. Thomas entered the room, his movement still perfectly disciplined but his face holding a genuine, relaxed smile that the staff hadn't seen in a decade. He placed a newly minted brass plaque into Arthur's hands, a plaque that would be installed at the entrance of the Hartford Gallery the following morning. Arthur rubbed his thumb over the clean, deeply engraved lettering, which didn't list corporate credentials, institutional waivers, or the sterling name. It simply read, "The Johnson Collection, restored by truth." He looked down at Lily, who was now showing her mother a drawing of three people standing together under a bright, warm sun, their shadows finally blending into the ground beneath them. The old clocks in the hallway continued their soft, measured ticking, marking the passage of a time that was no longer being guarded or endured, but lived out loud, proving that when the right people finally choose to look, the truth doesn't just make the burning go away, it builds a home where everyone can finally sleep. The story of Arthur, Maya, and little Lily serves as a profound mirror for our modern world, stripping away the artificial layers of status to reveal what truly matters. It reminds us that raw talent, deep-rooted intuition, and genuine worth are never dictated by expensive credentials, titles, or the polished background society chooses to notice. Too often, we find ourselves trapped in the exhausting cycle of judging people by their exterior tailoring or their past misfortunes, completely blind to the quiet geniuses standing right in front of us. This narrative beautifully illustrates that real healing, both physical and emotional, comes when we dismantle our rigid prejudices and allow authentic voices to speak through their actions. By choosing to embrace radical honesty over comfortable deception, we can break free from the suffocating demands of societal expectations and reconnect with our shared humanity. In our own lives, we can apply this lesson by actively looking past superficial labels, defending those who have been unfairly minimized, and honoring the quiet dignity of honest labor. Let this journey inspire you to value people for the truth of their character and the integrity of their work, ultimately creating a more compassionate, equitable space where everyone has the permission to thrive. This story is created entirely for educational and motivational purposes, aiming to inspire a deeper reflection on human values and the structural boundaries that often keep us apart. As the author of this story, my personal perspective is shaped by a deep belief that every human being carries an inherent spark of genius that corporate systems and social hierarchies often fail to recognize or deliberately ignore. When we look at little Lily, we see the unfiltered courage of a child who refuses to let powerful adults rename her family's truth, a reminder that the most profound wisdom often comes from the most innocent mouths among us. True power does not belong to those who build billion-dollar empires of stone and logistics, but to those who possess the moral clarity to stand up, admit their wrongdoings, and actively correct a historical injustice. This narrative highlights how easily prejudice hides behind the clean wallpaper of institutional procedures, legal waivers, and professional standards designed to protect the elite. We must learn to stop confusing price with worth, realizing that the most valuable gifts in life are often wrapped in the simplest, most rustic memories of our past. By stepping out from behind the barriers of polished wooden corporate titles, we open ourselves up to a deeper, more meaningful connection with the people who actually make our world run. It is my sincere hope that this story challenges you to look at the quiet background of your own life and find the hidden mastery waiting to be seen. Let us collectively strive to build a reality where justice is not a rare act of billionaire generosity, but a natural, everyday extension of human respect. Please note, the story above contains creative elements and has been developed with the assistance of AI technology, with the sole purpose of providing engaging entertainment while delivering valuable, deeply inspiring life lessons for our listeners. All characters, names, and events depicted in this video are entirely fictional and do not represent any real persons or actual occurrences. Disclaimer: the content provided in this video is intended for entertainment, educational, and motivational purposes only. It does not constitute professional medical, legal, financial, or psychological advice. The views and opinions expressed within this narrative are those of the characters and the creative storytelling process, and should not be used as a substitute for professional consultation or guidance. The creators of this channel disclaim any liability for any actions taken by viewers based on the conceptual themes presented in this story.